So this panel is going to be on enterprise adoption, and we're going to be covering some of the organizational challenges, barriers, tips, techniques, tools, and things that our distinguished panel has gone through over the last couple years in a number of different implementations that we're going to talk about. We'll spend about 30 minutes just doing a Q&A amongst ourselves, and then we'll save the last 10 minutes for questions from the audience. So as we're going through our discussion, be thinking about any questions that you may want to ask each of our panelists. I'd also like to thank Cloudnexa for sponsoring the panel and bringing a great group of guys together. They're a platinum sponsor of reInvent, and we appreciate their support. So let me go ahead and introduce, this is the part where I read everybody's bios and they kind of squirm because nobody likes to have their bios read out loud, but let me go ahead and introduce first Lex. Lex has 30 years of technology management experience. He is currently Executive Vice President of Software and Services for the Conservation Services Group. Lex has experience in product development, infrastructure, business systems, as well as information technology. Prior to CSG, Lex was Vice President and CIO of Earth Networks, which created the WeatherBug, which I'm sure you may have heard of. And previous to that, Lex served as Vice President of Technology at PurePlay Capital and has held executive roles in companies such as Calix, Lotus Development Corporation, and Bain & Systems. Rich, to my left, is Director of Infrastructure for Bristol-Myers Squibb. He is responsible for the identity and access management as well as the infrastructure architecture for Bristol-Myers Enterprise Services Group. He has 30 years of experience leading networking and computing infrastructure teams for RCA, GE, and now Bristol-Myers. And then lastly, we have MJ, and I call him MJ because his last name is really hard to pronounce, so we'll keep it short for MJ today. I've worked with MJ for a couple years. MJ is the CTO of Cloudnexa and is a founding management team member for Cloudnexa. He has over 15 years of experience in a high level of success in several industries, manufacturing, financial services. MJ has worked with a number of cloud management companies prior to Cloudnexa for the last 10 years. And MJ's led over 75 AWS deployments over the last couple of years for Cloudnexa. So I think we have a great panel with folks in varying degrees of implementation. So before we get started, let me ask the audience real quick. I like to keep this sort of open as we go through these questions because we're not going to get through all of them. If we were to have more conversation around, say, tools, techniques, technologies, or more conversation, say, around business drivers, organizational barriers, things like department chargeback models, how many of you would rather our conversation steer more towards some of the business issues of deploying cloud and how you go about that? Okay, and how many on the technology side? That's exactly opposite of what I expected. Excellent. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with our first question, and I will start with Lex. So Lex, at Earth Networks, what was the biggest driver? You guys were an early adopter of cloud, so what was the big driver behind your project?
Well, the company is a weather company predominantly. It has some other businesses, and found itself with 5 co-location centers that had a bunch of fairly old equipment living there. And the real driver, the business driver, was modernization, data center modernization. So we had a couple of choices. We could have gone ahead and created a new infrastructure, colo infrastructure, and done traditional virtualization, or we could go with a cloud approach. And of course, with the weather business, there's an awful lot of peak load problems that happen when hurricanes and blizzards come along, peak traffic events come along, and then the rest of the time, we had 85% or more excess capacity. So we certainly could have done a traditional virtualization approach and pulled that off very nicely, but the opportunity to become more agile and flexible and scalable and pay for what we were using was very appealing. We also had the opportunity really to consolidate a lot of legacy applications and databases at the same time and do so with either managed services or services that were more appropriately scaled in moving to the cloud. So that was what really drove us.
Okay. And did you, as a part of that and identifying all the applications in your data center, did you put together sort of a list of those? I assume there was a ranking process, or how did you select what were the first couple candidates?
We did. It was actually, at the time, not too entertaining process, but looking back, it's sort of entertaining to look at it. We stack ranked the applications. We actually didn't know about some of the applications that lived in the data center. They weren't documented. They didn't break down often, obviously, or we would have known about them. And so we ranked and stacked what we could, and then we had to make a decision whether we were going to go take the biggest, ugliest, most difficult application and move it first, or start with things that were relatively modern. And because really different, really not specifically related to an AWS migration, what we had to do was get ready for applications running in a clean, homogeneous network, server OS version, database version environment. We actually picked the largest, highest scale and oldest infrastructure and tore into that. I'm not sure if that was smarter or not in retrospect, but that's how we ended up doing it. And we learned a lot in that process, and then re-ranked the list and went from there.
Got it. And Rich, what was the main driver behind BMS getting started with AWS?
So in our case, we had done a lot of work virtualizing our infrastructure in our traditional data centers. So we have data centers regionally, traditional large corporation data centers. So we had gotten a lot of the benefits of virtualization already. So in our case, we really look at it in a couple of different ways. First of all, there was an overall push from our CIO to get more into the cloud, both from a SaaS perspective and an IaaS perspective. And so that was the larger driving force. And then within infrastructure, we're looking at this as an opportunity to clean up a lot of the practices and processes that we've had that have been embedded for many years in the traditional data center environment, to automate things which today may be manual or via homegrown scripts. This gives us an opportunity to build a greenfield environment in Amazon to improve a lot of those processes. So that's one aspect of it. Another is that the flexibility that we will get by moving to Amazon is very appealing to various parts of the company. So our application development group is probably the one who's pushing us the most strongly into this environment, because in the traditional data center environment, it takes weeks or months to spin up servers in some cases. In Amazon, with the automation that we expect to have in place, we'd like to get that down into the minutes and hours. So there's a lot of internal interest.
Got it. So MJ, you're working with Rich on some of the automation. What does some of that automation look like, and how are you going about that?
Yeah, so it is a challenge when you take this traditional and moving into the scalable model like Amazon, and that's really what we're facing right now. We're working with Rich on defining those application stacks that make up the majority of deployments, but also looking at it from the standpoint of how do we standardize it and easy deployment. Really help out their DevOps team, give them a chance to go into a catalog of CloudFormation scripts, which we're utilizing pretty heavily right now, and bringing that into the BMS environment. And now it gives the opportunity for the developers to go in and start playing with their application stacks from a push-button standpoint.
Got it. So how do you, when you do that and you start to roll the tools out to the organization, Rich, how do you sort of control either the cost or the use of those tools? So once the tools are out there and folks are leveraging it, what types of governance processes are you guys thinking about, or procedures, or how do you guys plan to manage that?
So I think there's a couple of directions we'll go there. One, and we're still in the very early processes of thinking about the governance, but one is less to restrict what people can do and more to give visibility. And so that's one of the, I think, the key tenets of our environment within Bristol-Myers Squibb is not so much for IT to tell the business what they can and can't do, but to give visibility into the costs. So that's one of the things that we really like about the VNOC platform Cloudnexa have, is it gives us a lot of visibility into the actual costs of some of these projects, where today, in our traditional environment, we have a sense for what the costs are, the fully loaded costs, but in the Amazon environment, you get a much more direct visibility into what those actual costs are. And so that's what we're going to rely on most, is that visibility. And if the business wants to spend X amount of money on a particular project, that's fine with IT. That's a business decision.
Got it. And will you structure that in terms of chargebacks to those departments in terms of billing?
So we're still working through that, but the intent is to have the business pay directly for those costs that they incur.
Okay. And MJ, I'm curious, so things like chargebacks or budgets, so the tool that he referenced, VNOC, how does that handle that, or how do you set some of those things up?
The biggest challenge that we always face is when the client comes in, they know that from Amazon you're going to be very transparent and be able to see the cost directly, but now it's assigning those costs back to where it needs to go. So what VNOC did is we took the detailed billing model, used tagging, created what we call a resource group, which is essentially a group of cloud assets, and then make them in your customizable report. So when you go in, you'll be able to, depending on the organization, either assign it to a department, an application environment, however you need to structure it to best serve you.
Okay. So Lex, in your deployments, the first one you did, it sounded like I think you had over 500 instances that you were running, a very large migration. If you were to tell the audience your biggest lesson learned in doing that, what would that be?
Well, it's a great question. I think in our case, it was understand it before you move it, but we also had the need to get to a clean environment as well, because the older environment was failing and not supportable, sustainable, and there were plenty of other things to overcome, the change from capital expense and depreciation to operating expense, and again, just as MJ said, being able to charge back to a department and actually identify costs and pass them along. All these concepts were new, but honestly, we probably would have taken some more time if we had been given it to consolidate databases, for instance, and to get some of the legacy apps ready to move. Unfortunately, we had to do something, and so the strategy had to basically keep the business running while we did migrations. We were an early adopter of VPC and Direct Connect at the VPC. We were one of the few folks who, at that time, this is all old hat now, but we're a directly connected virtual private cloud implementation. And that allowed us to do in-place migrations where we take web front ends and leave the database present in the colo center and have very low latency connections between the two, and then move the database as a second step, for instance. But if you can do that, and obviously virtual private cloud now is kind of the default approach, then that eases the pain and makes it possible to fail, but fail safely in order to get applications moved, try things, find out that they're not going to work, and move on. So.
And did you experience organizational pushback from your first migration, since it was a very large migration? I mean, it was an entire data center. Well,
the developers, the old line developers of the weather applications and so forth, first off said it was never going to work, right? It was not going to perform. The machines weren't going to perform. The timekeeping wasn't going to be right. There was critical timekeeping with GPS applications and so forth. So there was a lot of skepticism. The other thing was the CFO and the financial organization saying, gee, we can buy an awful lot of equipment and depreciate it over 3 years. Now we're actually, running it as an operating expense. How's that going to work? And the way it worked, the way it ended up working, was that we ended up buying what we needed as an operating expense, not buying, literally 5 or 8 times more capacity than we needed, just so that we could depreciate it and spread the cost or lease the equipment or whatever. So overall, the cost savings were still there. It was just a radical shift in terms of belief systems about, well, gee, that's what we have a line of credit for, to buy equipment from our preferred vendors and so forth. So what's so bad about this, right? We can depreciate it over 3 years. But obviously, a ton more capacity than we needed. So.
And what was, maybe Rich, I'll ask you this, what will be, or what is the first application you guys plan to migrate, and how did you pick that?
So in our case, there's, I think, 2 different categories that we're looking to move first. So we're still in that very early process, so that we hope before the end of the year to get a couple of apps production apps into Amazon. So one is an IT-supported application, which is the corporate directory lookup application, which is actually one of the more heavily used applications that we have. And the nice thing is it was written relatively recently, so it's a standard Java stack, which is what we're actually working with Cloudnexa to build first. So it's a good candidate application. It's supported internally by IT. We can run them in parallel if we need to, and use that as a learning experience. So that's most likely one of our first. The other is the application development group that I mentioned earlier is very interested in getting access to Amazon to start learning about the environment, building new app dev models in that space. So those are probably the two, the corporate directory application and then the app dev stacks.
So it's not necessarily department by department, it's more application specific as far as how you're going to go about it.
Right. So the way we're planning it, because like any other large company, there are thousands of applications and hundreds of different departments. So we're trying to do it by category. So we have the Java applications, the .NET applications, the SharePoint applications. And so our intent is to build those models in the new environment and then move those as a class into the new environment. And like Lex, we also have categorizations of applications. So we've taken off the table the ones that are absolutely most secure or have the highest risk from whatever the information security classification is, or whatever those classifications are that we've established. So we've taken all the high-risk ones off the table, so that leaves 80% of the environment or so that are candidates for moving.
And so, Lex, are you taking the same approach now that you're with a different organization at the Conservation Services Group? I know you're getting started as well with the second
Actually,
one.
yeah, less pressure in terms of aging infrastructure and more pressure in terms of data quality and quantity. So we're working on centralizing on Oracle RDS and SQL Server RDS, and also have been working with Redshift very successfully for 4 or 5 months now in a variety of BI tools, learning a lot about how they will work in the environment, because the company gets a lot of data from its energy utility company clients, and so we're really at this point kind of trying to normalize the database schemas, get them cleaned up, get them moved to RDS, take some of the actually fund some of that by getting rid of contract DBA services and so forth. So really, again, buying the service that we need as in the amount that we need it, and making it very portable, getting smarter about that. And then all of the new web apps that we're putting out, of course, are EC2 based. So.
Okay. So some of the, MJ, you had referenced some of the automation that VNOX incorporated using CloudFormation. Can you talk a little bit more about how you would go into a client and set that up, and kind of what's the process and best practices around that?
Yeah, I mean, when we go into a client that has limited experience with AWS, the goal in the beginning when we're setting up a CloudFormation is to introduce them to multiple services. So not just to limit it to EC2, but introduce ELB, RDS, like Lex was mentioning, as well as EC2, of course, but really give them a variety so that way they can see how it's going to play into their organization as they're evaluating additional applications. Also, with CloudFormation, we want to be flexible enough so they can play around with failover and making sure that you're doing best practice around multiple availability zones, so that way you can have a higher redundant deployment.
So does that, when you look at, say, QA, test, and production environments, I know some of the things that incorporates is spinning down and spinning up resources based on a certain schedule. I mean, can you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we found is, clients, they move to AWS to save money, and when you're in the traditional co-location, you buy hardware and it's running 24/7, but in Amazon it's a true utility model. So when you're just looking at a dev environment, there's two ways you can look at that. One is temporary and you can throw it away when you're done, and the other is really just setting up an environment that you put on a time schedule. And what that means is in VNOC we created this concept of capacity management around time-based environment access. So during the day, during working hours, you can have your non-production environments available, and at nighttime have them automatically shut down, saving you 50–60% of the cost.
Right, I mean, we use the tool with light reserved instances in order to manage the developer cost down, because the developers and testers are the worst. If left to their own devices, they'll leave everything on, lights are on, the coffee maker's on, all the instances are running, right?
Have you seen pushback from, this is to all three of you, when you start to implement some of the automation tools that are bringing down some of those development environments at night, spinning them up, do you get pushback from the developers, or do they start to get a little upset when some of those automation tools kick in, or?
Well, you know, it's a good test of who's working late and what exactly they're doing. Certainly, you know, and initially there's always skepticism about, well, you know, I want this stuff to be available all the time, so if I happen to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with a brilliant idea, but it's just not worth it, you know, honestly.
And I think in our case, we're looking at that as a positive, where the ability to spin up environments quickly in Amazon means we can shut them down.
Sure.
And if the developer does need it for whatever reason, we can spin it up relatively quickly. So it gives us the opportunity to shut more things down or quiesce them because we can spin them up more quickly. Got it.
So Lex, I know in our prior conversations, I think you'd mentioned that you had sort of 500 instances that you had migrated. And when you make that business case, a lot of times when I'm talking with customers or partners, they'll look at it as sort of a one-to-one, which is I have 500 servers in a colo, therefore I have to do 500 instances of AWS. Did you have to go through a process with your management team of explaining kind of the peaks and the valleys and how you model that workflow workload so that you can look at what those cost savings would be?
Well, part of the business case to go with the cloud versus traditional virtualization was to try to scale up and down with load events and to be able to do that intelligently. What we did find, it was really closer to 900 instances. Most of them weren't even instances; they were actual machines. And when we finished, we were around 330 instances in production. There were more that were used in development and test, but they were on schedules and so forth. So we ended up with a much smaller environment, partly, not all because of AWS, but partly because of cleaning up the mess. But at that point, we also went after being able to auto-scale and shrunk way down in the middle of the night and way up during a storm event so that the instance count was more of an average. And spent an awful lot of time using tools like VNOC to look at what was actually happening, which starts to be sort of like watching a sports event or whatever, right? When load's going up and down, and there are things that start to worry you that have nothing to do with cost, right? It's more is the consumer experience still staying there? So we had to improve our monitoring and so forth from a customer experience point of view versus availability. So I guess you'd say we shrunk down partly because we had a homogeneous environment which was well architected for us to move into on AWS. We also did a bunch of cleanup, and then we made the environment elastic as a second step. We were, again, in the virtual private cloud, and some of the tools that we needed at the time to do auto-scaling did not work properly, weren't ready, weren't released, and they are now. So it would be much easier in a virtual private cloud to extend in and then start to auto-scale right upon deployment rather than move everything with some sort of average load expected, right, or peak load expected, and then auto-scale. Mm-hmm. Makes more sense to do it all at once now than it did.
And Rich, have you started to see some of the improvements, or are you measuring sort of cycle time from dev, prod, to push, and deploying those environments? Is that your main success metric at BMS for leveraging AWS across the development teams?
Yes, absolutely. So as I mentioned before, the cycle times today are very long, and so we'd like to enable more agility for our developers, and also the other parts of IT, including the data analysts, who sometimes have these clever ideas about how can I do X, Y, and Z, which is much more difficult to test in a fixed environment, traditional data center environment. So yeah, that's absolutely our metric.
Okay. So let me pause real quick and see if we have any questions. I want to make sure that we're addressing things that the audience wants to hear. So is there any folks that have some questions we can start with? Yes, sir. So the question is, from an organizational rollout, how did you work with your different IT groups to make sure that they're prepared, they understand, educated? Okay. You guys are getting started, so I don't know if it's too early.
Well, no, I can talk about our experience, because that's the process that we're involved in right now. And so we're fortunate in that the CIO made this a priority. So the CIO has it as a priority. The head of infrastructure, who I report to, has made this a priority. So it's pretty clear within the IT organization that this is not optional, it's something we need to do, and that there's a benefit. On the business side, there's a clear benefit to them in terms of agility and cost transparency, so that's a very easy message also. So in our case, we have drivers from inside IT, we have drivers from the business. And I think the one area where we're still wrestling with the organizational challenges are in the traditional operations teams who are used to operating things in a traditional data center environment. So things like monitoring, backups that we've been doing for many, many years, pretty much the same way, mapped differently into this new environment. So I think that's, for us anyway, that's the challenge.
Yeah. Lex, what about the conservation group?
The current group, interestingly enough, developers, I think there's a life cycle in adoption. Developers usually kind of come last. Some of them may have played with this kind of technology on their own and are very excited about it, but often the traditional developers, unless they've taken a look at the technology themselves, don't get it. So there's a lot of selling and explaining and some training and coaching required to get folks going and interested, sort of get their toe in the water, get them to build an app and deploy it, get them to go use the free usage tier, try something, and then all of a sudden, you know, the dumbest example was me just saying, well, I'm sure you have some home videos and so forth. Why don't you go, you know, take Cloudberry and back them up, right? And all of a sudden the light bulb goes on. It's crazy, right? But very intelligent folks who are very good at writing code and applications, but don't necessarily get the benefit. The IT folks in both companies have been much more on board right from the start and understand the benefit. And of course, in the current company, heavily virtualized with traditional VMware style approach, so they understand virtualization and its basic benefits. But they're struggling with storage management, they're struggling with reliability of systems, they're struggling with scalability and the database cleanup that we need to do. So they get it. In the last company, I'd say we did do some skill changing work. We did a lot of training. Some folks that worked in the data center and did nothing but swap parts and rack and unrack servers and so forth eventually found their way out of the organization because there wasn't any more of that to be done. But that was a small number, and the rest of the folks kind of got on board at one stage or another. But it is an interesting management challenge because you get different concerns from different folks. It's either, this really isn't relevant to me because I need to write code and this is just going to cause me to slow down and have to learn something, right? Or you get the person who says, well, gee, you know, now I'm going to have to do some different things. I'm not very comfortable with that, right? Or you get a person who gets really fired up and gets behind the effort. So it's, I didn't see a consistent response across the staff at all. So it was really kind of taking each person aside. And then it was funny, in the large migration context, after we got through it and it became successful and it was clear that all these objections had been overcome and that the system was actually working a ton better, and literally our ticket volume, you know, measured at the NOC level, you know, we had a 24-hour NOC, went down by a factor of 10. When that eventually dawned on people that, gee, you know, I'm not sitting here fixing bugs, I'm not, you know, running tickets all day long, I guess this really did work. It was like at some point they woke up and said, okay, now I get it. but not easy in terms of managing each of the individuals involved. I think after the fact, there was a lot of satisfaction that was driven by this, but before the fact, all sorts of objections, to manage and to coach and teach and explain. And the free usage tier is really a good way to get people to go play.
It's a great tip.
And you can do an awful lot with the free usage tier and knock yourself out. And if that doesn't get somebody excited, well, you got to wonder, what they're thinking.
Yeah.
So.
So, how much did you reduce your staff? Mentioned infrastructure groups and developer groups and so forth. Was there a significant reduction in staff, or was it more of a retraining?
It was more of a retraining. There were some folks that didn't make the transition, but it was really sort of self-selection, more comfortable racking machines and working with specific kinds of hardware. And of course, we were in a big colo facility where there was lots of employment opportunities, so they went on off and sought employment, turning screwdrivers and so forth.
So what percentage of staff did you reduce?
10%, really not. So the question was, so what percentage of staff did you lose, or was it more of a retraining thing, retraining challenge? I'd say on the pure IT side, we lost maybe 10% of the staff. Honestly, we redeployed those folks, or redeployed the budget, and we were able to go get much more done on the development side of things, which eventually converted even the hardest core non-cloud adopters. As a result, we're able to do really cool applications that we couldn't have done in the data center with any reasonable amount of expense. And we used DynamoDB for a Lightning application that was really cool, and that would have been almost impossible to set up on our own. So.
Did you see new roles pop up as a result of that? I mean, obviously
did,
you've got
yeah.
to change your organization, so I'm curious what the new roles were.
I guess what I'd say is there was the need to have an owner for the Amazon account that represented development, QA, and production. And in production, for a long while, that was me. But in development and QA, we needed to appoint someone to be sort of the czar of the account and use tools like VNOC to look at usage, because machine sprawl happens all the time, or instance sprawl, and sloppiness. Everybody's in a hurry trying to get their job done. So there's work to be done that didn't used to get done. There's also supervising, what comes in the bill, and support cases and so forth. So there are other things to think about that require different skills and willingness to do different things that are very challenging, but very different. Instead of calling the Dell reseller rep and ordering 20 servers and another storage tray, right? You're thinking about other things that have higher value. Unboxing them when they come and counting them all, all that sort of stuff, right?
So in our case, is actually, we have the opposite, which is we're in an outsourced operations environment. So we actually had to look for talent in order to help us move into this new environment. Yeah. So there's a lot of excitement within our organization, because it's new, it's an interesting a model, new skills to learn. So we're having.
I mean, there's a lot. The sales pitch is a good sales pitch, but you have to give it, right? You can't assume that folks are going to just say, "Oh yes, this is a good thing." Surprisingly, they all come along at a different rate. And obviously, the AWS itself has done a great job of kind of expanding the market awareness of this and making it easy to encounter and understand and learn about this, especially if you compare to, say, 2 or 3 years ago. So, getting some contagious excitement going, getting some early wins, then recognizing the folks responsible for that is, works pretty well.
Yeah, gentleman back there. Actually, could you stand up? Sure. Thanks. So the question was, how did they manage sprawl and the costs associated with that sprawl? So I'll start with, from a tool perspective, I'll start with MJ, because we've been keeping you quiet, so it's on you.
From our perspective, what we do as part of our managed service offering is also offer a platform called VNOC. And VNOC is really here to complement what the AWS console does. And if you just look at it from a pure cost standpoint, there's a lot of reporting and alerting tools, as well as governance around approvals before instances are even provisioned. So it'll go into a queue so a manager can review it and either accept or reject it before it's provisioned and start costing them money. And then just from a pure reporting standpoint, we put a lot of automated reports and alerts for the management staff to know when there's new instances coming into their environment, making sure they are on the time schedules that they're assigned to, and it's from a production standpoint, just making sure they're within a budget. And then you can put a budget policy on top of that resource group and be alerted when there's a threshold close.
So the other suggestion, in addition to using a tool which enforces a process, is to appoint an owner for, if there are sub-accounts, right, for development, test, production, appoint an owner for them, and then have a standing meeting where you literally use the tool and the reports and look at the trusted advisor reports and basically chunk through them and literally do it every week, which is hard because it takes a lot of time. It's sort of green eye shade work in a way. But what I found myself and the team doing was a lot just saying, okay, what are those 2 instances for again, and why do we need them running all day long? Why can't they be on a schedule? Could we downsize them? Could we solve this problem another way? So there's the upward force always exists, right? Spin up more instances, it's really easy, it's cool, everybody loves it, but the downward force has to exist from a management point of view, and it's time consuming, so you need to allocate the time to do it, and if you do it frequently enough, it's not such a pain. And it doesn't seem like you're just being, a budget-driven manager.
And so did you enforce tagging as a part of that as a policy? So
Definitely, yeah. If you couldn't identify an instance with an English name and an association for an application, then that was the first problem. All right, let's figure out who spun it up, where did it come from, what is it doing, what's it connected to? Okay, now we know. Now we can evaluate.
We tend to use Star Wars figures. I don't know why, but most of our resources.
Well, the instance names are so friendly to start with. They're easy to speak of.
Yeah, one question back there.
How did the conversations about security go?
The wonderful security. So how did you tackle the topic of security and go about educating your organizations?
Well, it's more of an issue in the current employer situation because utility companies believe that if you combine usage information with a name and address, that's effectively personally identifiable information, even though according to the law it is not. It's not a driver's license, it's not a social security number, not a credit card number. So that's why we're actually after the database problem first and using RDS, where security is kind of built into the infrastructure. We are considering the hardware-based, key-based encryption methods that have been rolled out as well, but that seems honestly like overkill at this point. Interestingly, the utility clients are about the most backward in terms of their own practices. I shouldn't be saying this, these are our customers, but they're also the most aggressive with respect to legal language and assertion and moving liability to us. And I actually had an attorney negotiating a simple confidential disclosure agreement who said, and something, literally I quote, well, you're probably just going to take our valuable data and put it in the cloud. And I bit my tongue, because it wasn't appropriate to say, well, and yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. But so it's a multi-part problem. More, I think we're going to spend money and time getting through the SSAE 16 process, which is the successor to SAS 70, and really work on our processes because that's where we're weak. The security of the cloud infrastructure and the database systems and front ends and so forth that we built are not our weakest link at the moment.
Rich, what about security at Bristol-Myers? I'm sure that was a big topic for you guys.
It was, and not just information security, but also the regulatory concerns. Right. So the good news for us, for the project that I've been talking about this afternoon, is that our R&D guys have actually been running in Amazon now for a number of years, and that's the keynote. They actually mentioned some of that work. So they spent the time educating the R&D QA people as well as the R&D information security people. So then when we came along with the project that we're working on today, there was already that background understanding of the information security and the regulatory implications. So first of all, we got them involved very early in the process. So if anybody's going to be doing this, make sure you get those guys day one involved, because the last thing you want them to do is to figure out you're doing this after the fact. And so we worked very closely with the information security team, very closely with regulatory folks, and it's made the process much smoother. Plus, Amazon gives you many of the tools, if not all of the tools that you need in their shared security model. And so there's plenty of information on their website about selecting the degree of security and protection that you want. So you have anything, you know, from the most secure to the least secure, and it's an option for you. So you can pick and choose between those options to the degree you need it.
In fact, we just released a new security white paper that actually goes into a ton of detail. So if you haven't downloaded that, it's a new one this week that I'd highly encourage you guys to download on the topic of security. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Could you just share the discussions you all had internally when you were evaluating other platforms like Azure and OpenStack, and how it evolved to the point where you all said, hey, I think AWS is what we're going to pick. And maybe a second question is, there's this notion that hybrid cloud, there is an argument for that. If you have a dedicated workload, then having something on-premise, running it is, it's faster, it's cheaper, it's better. Why didn't you all go down that path, and does it make sense to you?
So the first question is, how did you go about selecting a cloud provider? And the second question, could you repeat that one more time?
It's more, when
private
there's this notion that
hybrid cloud.
having a hybrid cloud does make sense sometimes.
Yeah, okay. So was a hybrid cloud in scope? If so, how did you go about it? So Rich, you want to start with that one?
Sure. So as I just mentioned, our R&D folks had already been in the Amazon environment. So for us, it was a natural transition for us to go into Amazon. Now, we did look at the other providers who were out there, but at that point, because we started relatively recently, Amazon at that point was already much farther ahead in terms of capability, scope, regions, security. So we were very comfortable maintaining that Amazon presence for our project. In terms of hybrid cloud, we are actually actively looking at that right now. So we have an internal project led by our operations team to look at implementing some of the orchestration and automation functions similar to what you get in Amazon internally, and we're working very closely with them to see if there are ways we can line that up.
Lex, what about yourself?
Well, I think when we made the decision at Earth Networks, there was no choice really that was clear. It was a very clear choice to go with AWS because of the sort of distant lead, and we were a very close Microsoft partner at that time, so we spent an awful lot of time doing an Azure evaluation. This was 2.5, almost 3 years ago. And honestly, the distance has just grown since then with Azure in particular, in terms of products and services and capabilities and so forth that you want to have when you get there so that you can innovate and build new products. So it's really not, you can do the traditional product manager thing, you can create grids and look at functionality, you can do an awful lot of proof of concept testing and so forth, and the results just come out very clearly. There's so many more building blocks to put together mashups that you can create available because of the breadth of the product offering that it's really kind of no contest, honestly, with AWS these days. And on the hybrid cloud side of things, what I'd say is certainly there are a lot of newer technologies that are available now, but the complexity of actually taking workloads locally and then moving them out to scale and potentially moving them back and so forth is quite a bit more difficult to pull off in most cases than just making an application run and be elastic in the AWS cloud, for instance. While certainly there are still people who are hardcore advocates of on-premise virtualization, and I'm sure there are reasons and applications where that makes a ton of sense, actually moving workloads back and forth sounds a lot easier than it actually is in practice, and it gets back to this same economic argument that keeps getting made, which is Well, you can buy equipment and you can virtualize heavily and you can maybe run the costs down significantly by running some stuff locally. But what everybody leaves out of that analysis is the people cost, the folks that are responsible for keeping those machines running and getting them set up and so forth. It's almost never the case when you see the spreadsheet that says, look, on-premise is cheaper, that they've burdened it with cost and management time. Almost never, right? And I don't know why that is, because it's so obvious when you're actually responsible for that kind of equipment that you have people and time and effort and tickets and problems to deal with that you don't when it's not your people and it's not your infrastructure, right? So those are the things to think about, I think.
Okay. Question there? The key what? Okay, so the question was what governance processes, and then specifically how did your structure change, the structure of your organization? So maybe were there changes that you had to make to your teams, roles that you had to add? That
Hard to hear.
Yeah. So let me ask the question like this. What was the single greatest change in process or your organization that you had to make when adopting AWS? So I don't know, Rich, if you want to, not to put you on the hot seat, but...
Well, I would say we're so early in that process that's exactly what we're wrestling with now. Although at Bristol-Myers Squibb, we have a very centralized IT group. So for us, we have fewer of the problems, I think, some other companies that have a lot of shadow IT groups. So for us, I think it's going to be less of a concern trying to deal with those sort of issues. But
well, I think you get back to information security drives most of this in most organizations, right? So you can certainly manage multiple AWS sub-accounts, and what Cloudnexa does helps with that, and tools and so forth. But and that's an approach that some folks take, right? Literally, here's an R&D sub-account that rolls up to the parent account, has its own governance, but what gets in the way typically, unless it's completely separate and there's no company proprietary data there and nothing that needs to be protected, which I suppose in some companies it would be the case, then there's a central directory like Active Directory that is used for user and device governance, right? That has to be centrally controlled somehow, so the security context for the applications and services in the Amazon account still need to be managed just like they would if they were in a physical data center. So honestly, that side of it, and tickets that come in, and change management, documentation and auditing, all the same, right? The key difference, though, is that you don't have to be a cost accountant anymore to figure out what it really costs to do things. So, if you take the tools that are available, you can actually say, well, look, this application costs $1,000 a month or $10,000 a month to run. And honestly, then the finance folks have to figure out, how to actually budget for that and deal with it, because, a lot of those costs, you'd have to be a cost accountant to actually figure it out, right? You'd have to apply a bunch of formulas, and with a detailed bill, you can actually, surface, or a tool like VNOC, you can actually surface a tagged application and say, this is what it costs.
So we have time for one more question. A gentleman in the green shirt. Okay, so patching, management of operating systems over the course of time, how does that change with cloud, and how do you manage that?
No real change. I mean, you may pick a different vendor or a different delivery method, But with the AWS approach, it's your responsibility, obviously, just like it would be if you had 500 machines running somewhere else, right? So you need to continue all of the security and patching and OS upgrade stuff that you've been doing. Good news is, of course, you know, the concept of snapshotting and so forth makes it, like any other virtualization platform, make it a lot easier to manage state, right? So if you want to say, look, let's snapshot a bunch of servers with a tool, and then let's do an upgrade, or let's do a major patch, and then be able to restore from a snapshot, you know, is handy, right?
So I think in our case, we're wrestling with seeing if there is a different way we can do patching in a new environment. So, and we don't have an answer at this point, but the things we're considering is to what extent do we build and patch AMIs, and then every time a patch comes out, rev the AMI, versus having a process to patch a server once it's already been instantiated. So I think there are options.
Yeah, AMI management is actually a very interesting topic. So I'd encourage you to read up on what AWS is doing there and what some of the practices are. In some cases, it's appropriate to do AMI-related work to get to a current release, but that can create its own. There's, you know, if you think about instance sprawl, right, and cost and so forth, there's also the problem of AMI sprawl and being able to manage that with a tool and a process, right?
Okay.
Well, we'll go ahead and conclude. I'd like to give our panel a round of applause.